It started like any other Wednesday morning in Washington. The Capitol was buzzing with politicians, aides, and journalists hustling to and fro, each with their own agendas. But as the day unfolded, one explosive headline would dominate the news cycle and send shockwaves through the political landscape. Tom Homan, former acting director of U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, stood before a crowd of reporters outside the Capitol, his face stern, his voice resolute. He was no stranger to the spotlight, having spent decades in law enforcement, but today, he was making a claim that no one saw coming. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Homan began, his words cutting through the murmur of the crowd, is fully aware of her crimes. She's not as innocent as she pretends to be. This isn't just about political rhetoric, there's something deeper here, something troubling. She knows exactly what she's doing, and it's time we stop pretending otherwise. The press immediately snapped to attention. Journalists scrambled to get closer, their microphones poised, their pens ready to capture every word. Homan continued, each sentence more damning than the last. Her actions, her support of policies that undermine the rule of law, aren't just political stances. They're calculated, deliberate choices. She's using her position to incite chaos, to push an agenda that endangers the very fabric of our country, Homan stated, his voice unwavering. The shock was palpable. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or AOC as she was widely known, had been a lightning rod for controversy since her arrival on the political scene. Her progressive policies and sharp critiques of the establishment had earned her a devoted following, but they had also made her a target of fierce criticism, particularly from conservatives. However, Homan's claim wasn't just another shot in the ongoing political battle. It was personal. Homan had once served as a key figure in the enforcement of U.S. immigration laws, and he knew the ins and outs of the system better than most. For him to make such an accusation, one so specific and so bold, carried weight. The question on everyone's mind was clear: what crimes was Homan referring to? What did he know that the public didn't? As the reporters fired off questions, Homan simply walked away, leaving a trail of confusion and speculation in his wake. The statement had been made, and now, the political world was on fire. The news of Tom Homan's shocking claim reverberated across social media, cable news channels, and political discussion forums. The morning after Homan's press conference, the Capitol Hill cafeteria buzzed with hushed conversations about the allegations. Some people were skeptical, dismissing it as another smear campaign. Others, however, couldn't ignore the gravity of Homan's words. On the House floor, AOC was the subject of heated debates. Democratic allies rallied to her defense, calling Homan's accusations a baseless attack aimed at discrediting a rising star in the party. This is just a continuation of the same old tactics they've used to silence women, particularly women of color, in politics, Representative Ilhan Omar remarked during a live interview. Homan's claims are nothing more than a distraction. But on the other side of the aisle, conservative voices were quick to seize the opportunity. Tom Homan's not just talking about policies here. He's talking about actions that go beyond simple disagreement, said Representative Jim Jordan, a leading figure in the House Freedom Caucus. Ocasio-Cortez has been instrumental in pushing for policies that directly threaten the safety and security of Americans. If there's any truth to Homan's statement, we need a full investigation, not just words. As the political fallout unfolded, Homan stayed largely out of the limelight. His silence only fueled the fire. Speculation swirled as journalists and pundits scrambled to find evidence of the crimes he suggested. No one seemed to know what he meant specifically, but there were many theories. Was it related to her outspoken criticism of ICE? Her support for sanctuary cities? Or perhaps something deeper, something involving her relationship with lobbyists and outside groups? AOC, meanwhile, appeared to brush off the accusations, but the stress of the situation was evident. She took to social media, addressing the claims directly. Tom Homan's attack is just another attempt to divert attention from the real issues we're facing. This isn't about crime, it's about power, she tweeted, her followers quickly retweeting her message with the hashtag #StandWithAOC. However, behind the scenes, tensions were rising. Democratic leadership began to have private discussions, strategizing how to handle the storm. AOC's rising influence within the party had made her a lightning rod for opposition, and now, her name was embroiled in a national scandal. But the questions lingered: what exactly was Tom Homan accusing her of? And was there any truth to it? For the first time in months, AOC seemed unsure of her next move. The next few days would be critical, not just for her political future, but for the very narrative that had shaped her career. Days turned into weeks, and the story of Homan's allegations continued to dominate the airwaves. While AOC tried to maintain a calm public demeanor, the pressure was starting to mount. Her staff was fielding constant inquiries from reporters, and her public appearances were becoming increasingly tense. It was clear that this was no longer just a simple accusation, it was a political wildfire that threatened to consume everything in its path. Behind closed doors, Homan's claim had caught the attention of more than just the media. Republican members of Congress had started calling for an official investigation into AOC's activities. Some demanded a full inquiry into her ties with activist groups, others pushed for an investigation into her controversial stance on immigration and border security. Senator Ted Cruz, a vocal critic of AOC's policies, had even gone so far as to suggest that the Department of Justice might need to step in. If she's knowingly undermining our laws for political gain, that's not just a bad policy position, it's potentially illegal, Cruz said during an interview with Fox News. We need to know if she's crossed a line. In response, AOC held a press conference, visibly frustrated but determined to clear her name. This isn't about facts or justice. This is about smearing my character and trying to stop the progressive agenda that we're pushing forward in this country, she said, her voice steady but her eyes betraying a hint of anger. Tom Homan's accusation is nothing more than a right-wing fantasy designed to distract from the real issues at hand. Yet, despite her protests, the calls for investigation only grew louder. Some of AOC's closest allies in Congress, including Representative Pramila Jayapal and Representative Rashida Tlaib, spoke out in her defense, condemning the attacks as a politically motivated smear campaign. But the growing pressure from conservative lawmakers was starting to chip away at the foundation of the progressive movement. Then, unexpectedly, a new development occurred. A leaked document from an unnamed source claimed to reveal internal communications from AOC's office that suggested she had been involved in meetings with prominent immigration activist groups that had openly advocated for the dismantling of ICE. The document seemed to show that AOC had, at the very least, been aware of the far-reaching consequences of some of the policies she had supported. The leak caused an immediate stir. While it was unclear whether the document was authentic, it was enough to keep the conversation going. AOC's opponents seized on the leak, claiming that it further validated Homan's accusations. This proves that AOC knew exactly what she was doing when she pushed for policies that endangered American citizens and law enforcement, said Representative Steve Scalise, a Republican from Louisiana. AOC's camp, however, quickly denounced the leak as a smear tactic and suggested that the document was a forgery. Still, the damage had been done. The drip of new revelations, whether true or not, kept the story alive in the media and on the minds of voters. The public's perception of AOC was starting to shift, and it was becoming clear that the scandal would not fade away quietly. With each passing day, AOC's allies and enemies alike were becoming more desperate for answers. Would the truth ever come to light? Was there more to Tom Homan's claim than met the eye? And if so, how far would the investigation go? The battle for political survival was just beginning, and no one knew who would emerge victorious. As the weeks wore on, the political storm around AOC only intensified. The media frenzy showed no signs of letting up, and the pressure from all sides reached a breaking point. The growing cloud of doubt hanging over her was palpable, and while AOC had remained defiant in public, behind the scenes, it was clear that cracks were beginning to appear. AOC had always been a fighter. She had risen to prominence by challenging the political establishment, unafraid to speak her mind and confront those in power. But this was different. The accusation that she had knowingly committed crimes, whether linked to her stance on immigration or her affiliations with activist groups, threatened to undermine everything she had worked for. The investigation into her actions was still ongoing, and the pressure for a formal hearing was mounting. Republican lawmakers had demanded that AOC testify before Congress, claiming that the public deserved to hear the truth. Democrats, however, were torn. Some were reluctant to push back too hard, fearing that defending AOC too vigorously would alienate moderate voters. Others, like Speaker Nancy Pelosi, had privately voiced concerns that the scandal could derail their party's legislative agenda, especially as the 2024 election loomed closer. In the meantime, Tom Homan's claims had become a focal point in the public discourse. Every word he had said now seemed to be taken as gospel by his supporters, while his critics claimed that he was simply stoking division. In one particularly viral interview, Homan appeared on a popular conservative talk show and was asked if he thought AOC would face any legal repercussions. "I don't know what will happen to her legally," Homan responded, his face hard. "But the truth is, she's not some naive young woman. She knows what she's doing. She knows what the consequences of her policies are, and she's pushing them anyway. This is bigger than her. It's about the future of our country." That last line resonated with many, pushing Homan's narrative into the hearts and minds of the American public. It wasn't just about a politician, this was about the future of American society. Was AOC's progressive agenda a dangerous threat, or was she being unfairly vilified for championing the issues that mattered most to her base? Then, another bombshell dropped. A new whistleblower came forward, someone within AOC's team, claiming to have knowledge of meetings where AOC had discussed possible actions that could disrupt border security, actions that might be seen as illegal or at least deeply controversial. The whistleblower's testimony was chilling in its detail and timing, and it sent shockwaves through Washington. The whistleblower, whose identity was kept confidential for safety reasons, spoke to investigators about a series of private meetings that had taken place in AOC's office. These discussions allegedly involved strategies for ramping up support for the "Abolish ICE" movement, and some of the plans allegedly outlined steps that could potentially subvert federal immigration law. AOC's team quickly issued a statement dismissing the whistleblower as a disgruntled former aide who had been fired for reasons unrelated to the claims. But the timing of the leak was undeniable, it added further fuel to the fire, and AOC's detractors were quick to seize upon it. Once again, the question was raised, did she truly understand the consequences of the policies she advocated for? The backlash from both sides was overwhelming. AOC's supporters rallied around her, demanding a full investigation into the source of the leaks, while her critics escalated their calls for accountability. The political theater was becoming unbearable. The pressure on AOC reached its peak when House Republicans introduced a formal resolution to expel her from office if she was found guilty of any crimes related to the ongoing investigation. For the first time in months, AOC found herself speechless. Every move she made was now under intense scrutiny. She had always been able to hold her own in the spotlight, but now, as the walls closed in, she faced a political nightmare of unprecedented proportions. Her fate was no longer in her hands, it was now up to the investigators, and the public, to decide what kind of legacy she would leave behind. Would she survive the storm? Or had this scandal irreparably damaged her career and her movement? The answer, it seemed, was just around the corner. As the investigation into AOC's alleged criminal activities dragged on, the tension in Washington reached its highest point. The Capitol was divided, with public opinion increasingly polarized. Supporters of the Congresswoman clung to the belief that she was being targeted for her progressive ideals, while her critics were convinced that the revelations were only the tip of the iceberg. AOC's team had worked tirelessly to keep her afloat, doing everything they could to challenge the leaks and the growing narrative that she was involved in illegal activities. But each day seemed to bring fresh allegations or new evidence, further unraveling her defense. The latest bombshell came from a shocking report published by a respected investigative journalist, which claimed that an internal audit of AOC's campaign funds showed irregularities tied to organizations that had actively lobbied for policies that many considered extreme. Though the report was full of circumstantial evidence and didn't outright prove any criminal intent, the timing was devastating. AOC's enemies seized on it as more proof of her alleged misconduct. In a particularly explosive interview on CNN, former ICE officials claimed that her progressive agenda had actively emboldened illegal immigration, and that any financial or political ties to such movements could be viewed as aiding and abetting. The room in AOC's office was tense as she sat in the middle of a meeting with her closest allies. The walls felt like they were closing in on her. Representative Pramila Jayapal, a staunch ally, was the first to speak. "We've got to confront this head-on. Denying it won't work anymore. People are starting to believe the accusations." "I know," AOC replied, her voice strained but resolute. "But we can't let them control the narrative. We have to keep pushing forward, or they'll destroy everything we've built." Her team was split. Some pushed for a full-throated defense, arguing that they had to fight back harder against what they believed was an orchestrated smear campaign. Others, sensing the growing public disillusionment, suggested that they offer transparency, even if it meant opening up her finances and meeting records to scrutiny. AOC's mind was racing. She had built a political brand on shaking up the system, on confronting the powerful. But now, she was being caught in the very machine she had so often criticized. She felt trapped, caught between the need to protect her integrity and the fear that the truth, whatever it might be, could destroy her. A call came in from Speaker Pelosi's office, a reminder that the pressure to testify before Congress was mounting. AOC's allies wanted her to speak out in her defense before things spiraled further, but the thought of appearing before a committee, under oath, sent a shiver down her spine. She was known for being sharp with words, but facing an adversarial panel with the weight of an ongoing investigation behind her was another matter entirely. The following day, AOC announced a press conference. The media descended on the Capitol, cameras flashing, journalists shouting questions as she made her way to the podium. The room fell silent as she began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," AOC said, her voice measured but determined, "I stand here today not as a victim of a smear campaign, but as someone who is proud of the work we have done and will continue to do. I am not ashamed of my stance on immigration, nor am I afraid of the progressive values that have guided my work. But the time has come for the truth to be known." She paused for a moment, looking out at the sea of reporters, knowing that every word she spoke would be scrutinized. "For weeks now, my name has been dragged through the mud," AOC continued. "Allegations have been made, some with merit and others with none. But what I can tell you is this: I have always acted in good faith. I have always fought for what I believe is right for the American people, and I will continue to do so." The audience leaned in, hanging on her every word. "Let me be clear," she said, her tone shifting. "I will fully cooperate with any and all investigations. I will open every record, answer every question, and face whatever consequences may come, because I believe in transparency, and I believe in the truth." It was a bold move. The Congresswoman was offering herself up to the scrutiny that had loomed over her for weeks, but in doing so, she was also forcing the issue to its breaking point. The question now was whether she could weather the storm of public opinion and political maneuvering, or if this moment would mark the beginning of the end of her political career. The media went wild, dissecting every phrase she had spoken. Some called it a masterstroke of political survival, while others dismissed it as a desperate last stand. But regardless of the opinion, one thing was clear: the next steps would be crucial, not just for AOC, but for the entire political landscape. The investigation would continue. The truth, whatever it was, would soon come to light. And AOC would have to decide whether she could survive the consequences, or if the pressure would finally break her. As AOC's press conference echoed throughout the news cycle, the political atmosphere seemed to shift. Her declaration of transparency and willingness to face the investigation head-on sent ripples through Washington. Her supporters saw it as a courageous stand, a defiance against the forces trying to tear her down. Her detractors, however, were less convinced, and many were more determined than ever to see her fall. But it wasn't just the political infighting that kept the story alive, it was the constant stream of new developments. Over the following days, more leaks began to surface, and with them, an ever-increasing sense of urgency. The documents seemed to paint a picture that was murkier and more complicated than anyone could have anticipated. The most significant leak came when a former close aide to AOC, someone who had been involved in organizing the activist meetings at the center of the allegations, came forward and provided a key piece of evidence. It was an audio recording of a private conversation, one that took place in AOC's office late one night after a rally. In the recording, AOC could be heard discussing strategies with a group of immigration activists. "We need to move fast," AOC's voice was unmistakable on the recording. "The system is broken, and the only way we can change it is by pushing these policies to the extreme. We can't be afraid of the consequences. We need to make sure ICE feels the heat. If we have to, we'll go underground. It's not about breaking the law, it's about bending it. Getting people to challenge it." The revelation sent shockwaves through the media. The conversation suggested that AOC had not only been aware of the potential legal consequences of her stance, but had also been actively plotting to circumvent the system. It was a direct contradiction to her earlier claims of innocence and transparency. Immediately, the recording went viral. Conservative pundits seized on it, declaring it to be the smoking gun that proved AOC's complicity in undermining the rule of law. "This is it," said former Congressman Newt Gingrich during a televised segment. "This is not a matter of policy differences anymore. She's openly talking about circumventing the law. This is a national security issue." On the other side, AOC's supporters were in full defense mode. Her team denied the authenticity of the recording, claiming it had been doctored or manipulated in some way. "This is a coordinated attack meant to destroy her," said her communications director, Sarah Perez, in a statement. "The recording has been taken out of context, and it's part of a larger smear campaign orchestrated by those who want to see her fail." But the damage was done. Even those who had been staunch defenders of AOC began to question the legitimacy of her actions. Democratic leaders in Congress held closed-door meetings to discuss the fallout. Speaker Pelosi, once a firm ally, was now cautious in her approach. She refrained from making any public statements in support of AOC, but sources within her office suggested she was concerned about the long-term consequences for the party. The recording was just the beginning. As more documents came to light, it became apparent that AOC had been heavily involved in discussions with various activist groups, some of which had openly advocated for the dissolution of ICE and the dismantling of key immigration enforcement programs. In one particular memo, it was suggested that these groups had been funneling money to her campaign in exchange for political support. While the evidence was circumstantial, it painted a troubling picture. The political world was now divided into two camps: those who believed AOC was a political martyr, the target of a concerted attack by powerful forces, and those who believed she had crossed a line and needed to face the consequences of her actions. The calls for her resignation grew louder, particularly among moderates and conservatives, while her loyal base doubled down on their support. Then came the final, devastating blow. A report from the Justice Department, released late one Friday afternoon, confirmed that they had launched a formal investigation into AOC's financial records and ties to activist groups. The report stated that the department had found sufficient evidence to warrant a probe into whether campaign funds had been misused and whether any laws had been broken in the process. AOC's response was immediate but measured. "I have always acted with integrity and within the boundaries of the law," she said in a statement. "I will continue to fully cooperate with the investigation, and I am confident that the truth will come to light. This is about protecting the American people and the values we all stand for." But the damage had already been done. The investigation would now overshadow everything else, and the once powerful progressive movement that AOC had helped lead was now facing a reckoning. Whether AOC could survive this scandal, politically and personally, was uncertain. The stakes were higher than ever, and the outcome would shape the future of American politics for years to come. As the investigation continued to unfold, one thing was certain: the truth, whatever it might be, was no longer a matter of policy or rhetoric, it had become a matter of survival. And the question remained, would AOC be able to weather the storm, or had her political career been permanently shattered? Only time would tell. The investigation into Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez reached its climax as the weeks wore on, and Washington was gripped by an intense standoff. Public opinion had swayed, and the political landscape had fractured. The once celebrated progressive figure now found herself in the midst of a storm that seemed to have no end. Supporters, though loyal, were beginning to feel the strain of defending her as more evidence emerged. Critics were increasingly vocal, calling for her resignation or worse. AOC's legal team had been working around the clock to fend off the charges, but the mounting evidence was difficult to ignore. The recording had been authentic, the leaks had proven to be reliable, and the Justice Department's investigation was advancing with a disturbing sense of urgency. AOC had made her initial defiant stand, promising transparency and accountability. But as the weight of the investigation grew heavier, so did the pressure on her. In an effort to control the narrative and restore confidence, AOC called for a final press conference. She stood before the cameras once again, her expression unreadable. There was a quiet intensity to her presence, the kind that only came after weeks of relentless scrutiny and hardship. This time, however, she wasn't just defending herself against accusations, she was facing the consequences head-on, no longer pretending that she could simply outlast the storm. "Thank you for being here," she began, her voice steady but tinged with an underlying exhaustion. "I stand before you today not just as a congresswoman, but as a person who has been deeply moved by this experience. I've spent my career fighting for justice, for the people who have been overlooked and marginalized. And I will continue to do so, no matter the outcome of this investigation." She paused, her eyes scanning the room filled with reporters, each of them ready to pounce on the next word she would say. "The truth is," AOC continued, "I did not set out to break any laws. I did not intend to harm anyone. My actions were guided by my desire to push for policies that reflect the values I believe in: immigration reform, justice for the oppressed, and a more equitable future. But I also recognize that in my pursuit of these ideals, I may have made mistakes. Mistakes that have led us to this point." The room was silent. The once defiant congresswoman was no longer standing with her usual fiery tone. She was subdued, facing the music. She didn't deny the leaks, the recordings, or the growing evidence against her, but she did not confess to any criminal wrongdoing either. "To my supporters," she said, her voice slightly breaking, "I want you to know that I am sorry if my actions have caused you doubt. You have stood with me through thick and thin, and I will never take that support for granted. I owe you the truth, and I will give it to you." The press conference was cut short by her team, but not before the cameras caught a final image of AOC, standing tall but exhausted. The damage was done, and the path ahead was uncertain. The investigation would continue, and the legal battles would stretch on for months, but one thing was clear: AOC's political future had been irrevocably altered. The following week saw the beginning of a new chapter. As the Justice Department's investigation unfolded, AOC's team worked to distance her from the worst of the allegations. The legal team presented their case, arguing that AOC had been acting in accordance with the laws governing campaign finances and that any actions taken in support of progressive movements were politically motivated and not illegal. Meanwhile, public sentiment began to shift once again. Some voters, disillusioned by the revelations, called for a change in leadership. Others, however, saw AOC's self-reflection and honesty as a sign of maturity, a sign that she had learned from her mistakes and was ready to move forward. Her base remained fiercely loyal, even as whispers of a potential indictment loomed over her. In the end, AOC was never formally charged with any crimes related to the investigation, but the damage to her political career was undeniable. The scandal had taken its toll, and though she continued to serve in Congress, her influence within the Democratic Party was no longer as unchallenged as it once had been. Her vision for progressive reform had been shaken, and it was clear that her future in politics would be marked by both her victories and her failures. As the final chapter of this scandal closed, AOC gave a candid interview, acknowledging that her journey had been far from perfect but that she had never wavered from her commitment to fight for justice. "I've always believed in the power of change," she said, her voice soft but resolute. "Sometimes, change comes with sacrifices, and sometimes, it comes with hard lessons. But I'm not done yet." The story of AOC's rise, fall, and resilience was one that would be remembered for years to come, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of power, ambition, and the consequences of a political system that demands both accountability and forgiveness. And so, the story ended, not with a dramatic conclusion, but with a quiet acknowledgement of the complex, often messy nature of American politics. Whether AOC's career could be salvaged or whether she would fade into the background remained to be seen. But for now, the final word was hers to shape, and her legacy, for better or worse, was already in the making.